Primitive War director Luke Sparke is back with another creature feature in Scurry. And this is a very different movie to Primitive War in regards to scope. Whilst Primitive War was, had a relatively large cast, it was a kind of expansive movie with a kind of an open world, this kind of Vietnam jungle. Scurry is about two people, effectively, and it all takes place underground. I would say this movie is comparable in some ways to movies like A Quiet Place. And this one stars Jamie Costa. And what we have is a sort of end-of-world situation where creatures have appeared from beneath the ground and are causing havoc on our world, or at least in this particular kind of area of America somewhere. And it focuses on Jamie Costa's character, who is our kind of central protagonist, and he basically kind of wakes up after falling in a kind of giant sort of sinkhole, really. And he initially doesn't know what's happening, he just kind of thinks it's an earthquake. And, you know, he finds himself kind of trapped underground, where he meets another person who is trapped underground, this woman. And together they have to try and kind of find a way out of this kind of underground labyrinth of tunnels and caves and sewer systems and things like this to try and get back to their respective families. All the while being hunted by large kind of like arachnid-like creatures that are hungry for human flesh. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss. So Luke Sparke is clearly going to become the creature feature guy, I would say, going forward. Now, he is an Australian filmmaker, but I think this is taking place at somewhere in America. And as I say, it's a different movie in regards to tone and kind of stylistic choices. The kind of the Primitive War was quite a fun, somewhat schlocky B movie. This is a very much a kind of a claustrophobic style thriller, and obviously focusing on just two characters, and we pretty much see it nearly all from their point of view. Some interesting directorial choices here, where the camera, we have it kind of almost sort of floating around these sort of two characters. It almost feels like this movie is filmed in real time. I don't know if it's meant to be, but it kind of feels like it almost is, if it isn't actually a kind of a real time movie, with this kind of camera almost at some points having like a kind of a cross section view of these kind of tunnels, so we can see them crawling through this kind of these tunnels with kind of like earth either side and things like this, and having to kind of traverse sort of dangerous cave-ins, these creatures, and kind of like various other kind of like bits of kind of sharp objects and stuff like that. So with the camera kind of almost sort of floating around these characters, almost like it's kind of orbiting them. So it's sort of some interesting kind of directorial choices here, but it kind of makes sense and kind of adds to that kind of claustrophobic feeling that I think this movie is clearly going for. And this is quite a tense film. Now, we do have quite a lot of these creatures that turn up, but the movie never really sort of spends too much time with them on screen. Now, we do have quite a few interactions with them, but we only sort of see the sort of brief shots of them. So they have this kind of feeling of, we don't quite know, what they are. We get the idea that they're kind of giant arachnids and things like this, but the camera, certainly until the end, rarely sort of spends kind of much time on them. So you have a kind of fear of the unknown, and part of the kind of the charm with this movie, if you like, is that we have these two characters trapped in the dark underground. And the way this movie sort of makes us kind of relate to them is that it has this sort of sound design where we hear the creatures more than we see them. So we know that there's something kind of lurking in the dark, and yet occasionally with their kind of camera phones and things like this, we'll see sort of them start to come into the light and things, and they are big. So, you know, we are seeing them as the kind of the characters are seeing them, but maybe, you know, you're not like a fully lit kind of like example of what it might be. They're kind of creeping out the dark, and I think it adds to this sort of very sort of tense, as I say, claustrophobic and kind of dark feel to this movie. I mean, if you've seen the movie The Descent, it's not really like that, but it has that sort of fear of the dark element to it that I think made that movie so kind of scary. I don't know if it's quite as kind of terrifying as The Descent, which is a pretty scary movie in my opinion. And it's kind of, I guess you would say, a cross between like A Quiet Place and The Descent, to be honest. But it certainly is a pretty tense thriller. I have to say, for the most part, I enjoyed our characters. Jamie Costa, I think, does a great job of this kind of guy who really is, you know, pushed, shall we say, and his relationship with this kind of woman that he sort of meets, who has a sort of bit more of a checkered past, and sometimes an antagonistic relationship. You know, it's an interesting one, and there's some pretty nihilistic moments in this film. This movie is not a happy movie by any means. So it has a kind of a nihilistic sort of tone to it. So if you like quite a stark movie in many ways, then yeah, again, I think you might kind of enjoy it. Now this is clearly a much lower budget movie than the likes of Primitive War, which in itself wasn't a huge budget movie, but this is a lot lower budget than that. And I think the movie, whilst keeping the creatures sort of a lot of the time in shadow and in the dark, is able to benefit from, you know, having the low budget, sort of, you know, be seen a lot, because of having the effects kind of look a little bit ropey and things like this. There's one or two times where I think they still look a little bit on the cheaper side, but because the movie chooses to keep our creatures in the dark a lot of the time, or quasi-lit, it gets away with it for the kind of the most part. And I think the movie's strength here is the characters, and I do think this is a slower paced movie because it is a slow sort of crawl through these underground systems, but the tension is still there. So it's a slower burn movie in many ways, but it still has a high level of tension, which is quite a hard feat to pull off, I would say. I do think the acting is solid from our sort of characters. I mean, there's only two of them. We get a very brief glimpse of a couple of other people, but for the most part it's these two actors on screen, and they do a good job of keeping us engaged. And this kind of underground sort of system, you know, the way it's filmed, I think it's very inventive for the most part as well, and again, very, very claustrophobic. Maybe what doesn't work, so the fact that this movie is all underground makes it, by necessity, it's quite dark. And as such, deliberately so, this movie is very dark, and you will, by design, not be able to see very much. Now, it's obviously a choice by the movie, and it works, I would say, for the film that it's trying to be. That being said, people might feel a little frustrated and sort of like, I can't really see what's kind of going on. It's underground. There's not a lot of light sources. It is what it is. But I have to say that even in Primitive War, I felt sometimes it was a little dark at times in the night scenes. And again, this one, again, I fully appreciate this is the point of this movie. But yes, it is sometimes a little hard to see. But, you know, you can't really level that as a real criticism because, like I say, that's how this movie is meant to be seen. So, are there any other things that I could say that maybe would be more legitimate criticisms in a way? I think there's a little bit of like unnecessary drama between our two characters. We have a section in the movie where our characters sort of almost come in conflict with one another, and I just felt this feels like inflated drama because we have a limited amount of what we can kind of do in these situations, so why not have some inflated drama? And I thought if there's two people in this life or death situation, they probably aren't going to fight amongst themselves in this regard. So to me, it was a little bit guilty of having, it's not a long section, to be fair, they kind of move on with it, but yeah, having a little bit of inflated drama. Now, considering this movie is meant to be taking place under a city, the majority of these kind of like cave systems and things don't appear to be like sewers or things or underground railways, or there's not even a lot of like pipes and stuff. It appears to be like caves burrowed by these sort of creatures. And I thought, under the city, I would have imagined that there would be a lot more kind of like stuff under the ground, if you know what I mean. And maybe they were too deep. It's, you know, they look like they are quite deep, but again, the caves look like that they are more naturally formed or been the kind of like the made by these sort of creatures. I would have thought you would have seen more industrial stuff in there at that time. So we do get a section where they do come out in a kind of sewer area, but you know, there's not a lot of other things in there like cables or, you know, like say pipes under the ground, things like that, or even, as I say, not more sewers and things under the city. I can get it if that was in a more rural area. So yes, there's that. As I've said, there is one or two occasions where I think you could say the VFX show that they're kind of on the lower budget side. You know, I think they do a good job here of making it so that you don't notice the majority of the effects. And these creatures do look good, I will say. But yes, there's a couple of times where I think, particularly a shot towards the end of the movie, where we have Jamie Costa's character coming face to face with one of these things, and it doesn't quite look like it's animated to the full extent as it could be, is all I will say. Again, I can forgive this because I'm used to watching lower budget movies, but I have seen criticisms of other films where people just, you know, can't appreciate that not every film is a mainstream film, and, you know, there's one or two occasions where the effects might not be quite, you know, up to mainstream level effects here, but again, we have to think of the budget in this movie. The pacing of this movie might be a little bit slow for some, but again, this is a deliberately paced movie. I still think it maintains a good level of tension throughout the movie, despite it being a slower paced movie. So overall, I would say it actually does a good job with the pacing. But, you know, it is a long movie where we are focusing on just two characters shuffling around underground for long periods of time. So that's what you're going to get. Overall, I've got to say, though, the positives far outweigh the negatives for me. I think the negatives, to be honest with you, are relatively minor. And I think for the movie that this is trying to be, with the budget that we're clearly working with here, I think this is a good example of what you can do with that kind of level of budget. And there's really little else I think you could have done to make this movie a more watchable experience without fundamentally sort of changing what the film is. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. So it's a pretty strong movie. If you like a good creature feature, especially if you like A Quiet Place, like I say, I think it's a comparable movie in many ways. So 7 out of 10. What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.